Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Invest Power series. So you've actually managed to get a property unconditional now and you're about to settle. Now the next question is, do you need a property manager? Is property manager worth it? That's actually a really good question because I've had a couple of recent incidents where my client is asking, is a property manager actually really worth it, or should I be self-managing myself? So that's what I thought today. We'll touch a little bit on what does a good property manager do? Is property manager worth it? And how do you find a good property manager? So to start off, I actually like to preface a little bit because property manager is actually one of the most challenging jobs in my opinion. And it's one of those roles that you actually underestimate what is required to be done. And look, if I want to be blunt, I could probably say in most investors' opinion, what a property manager does is just collecting rent. And most of the time they don't actually do anything. And that's why a lot of investors will be thinking, well, how do I justify paying all these ongoing costs to the property manager when all he or she does is just collecting rent, and once they're finding a tenant, that's pretty much all they do. So if you think of it from that perspective, that's why people don't think a property manager is worth it. But in reality, and I can assure you, just like a lot of brokers will be able to tell you that we don't just write a loan. There's actually a lot more things in the background that we need to do. So using the same analogy for property manager, basically what they need to do is, until they find a tenant, they need to do a lot of work in terms of making sure that the property is looking great to attract prospects to come to the place and visit the place. And then they obviously need to understand what are the pain points of the prospective tenants in order to be able to get them to sign the tenancy agreement. So that's number one. And then after they secure the tenant, there's these paperwork that they need to do. There's these things, policies and processes that need to be put in place. There's routine inspections that need to be done. Yes, there might not be, on a day-to-day basis, there might not be that bad, but think of it like they're the one that's basically managing it for you so that you got that piece of comfort and you don't need to be caught up by the tenant on a day-to-day basis if there is a day-to-day issue, in case of reporting things such as, my toilet is blocked, I can't use my toilet, or my tap is not working, that kind of stuff. Very, very little details. That's what the property managers is tasked to do. They're not just collecting rent, but they're basically your managing agent in that respect. And even then, they have a very different, property managers varies very, very differently. So that's why it's important to be able to identify the good property managers from the lazy property managers, I should say. So what are the common traits of a good property manager? A good property manager will be looking at how he or she can add value to your life. So in other words, how you can be as less stressed and worried as a landlord. And by doing that, let's say for example, during a tenant selection, using myself as an example, I would always question my property manager. Who do you think would be most suitable for this property, and tell me why? So this is where you can rely on their expert opinion to say, let's say for example, you've got tenant A and tenant B. Okay, well, why do you think tenant A suits better or does not suit better? And why do you think tenant B on the other side may not suit better as well? So, I would rely on their opinion, and obviously, you as a landlord, you still need to make your own decision, but you can definitely rely on their industry experience to be able to guide you on what tenant you should be taking on to minimize your risk and maximize your rental return. So from tenant perspective, that's why I definitely think that there is worth it. They also do background checks just to make sure they're reporting, all facets of the tenant. And a good property manager at tenant selection will be able to give you that 360 degrees view and also give you a bit of guidance in terms of who they think could be a good one. And I can tell you that most of the property managers will probably be shying away from actually recommending either of the tenants because they don't want to be the one finger pointing or you finger pointing them later on to say, you told me we should get this tenant. So that's why they always try to dodge the bullet. But you know, I would still try to push them just to say, look, if you are in my position and I'm not going to hold you accountable for it, let me know who you think will be most suitable, because you've met them personally. You saw what their family situation is like, rather than just looking through, you know, everything on paper. You actually get to meet in person. You interacted with them. What were they like? How were they talking? What were they dressed? You know, are their kids a bit of troublesome? Are they running around trying to break things already? That kind of information is where a good property manager will be able to relate to you. Okay? And then there is another facet about compliance. You know, for example, safety compliance, or in terms of if the tenant is in rental arrears, what do you need to do? What sort of notices do you need to give to the tenant? And what sort of procedural steps, which varies state by state, what do you need to give to the tenant alerts at what point in time, in order for you as a landlord later on, if things does go south, so that you can claim from insurance. And that to me is absolutely critical, because let's say, for example, you know, you all know that I've got properties in Logan, and the tenant in Logan unfortunately isn't the best bunch. But you know, if a tenant, let's say for example, has been in arrears, then I will always rely on my property manager to say, okay, well, you know, 14 days in arrears, what is the next steps? You know, what notice do we need to give out? And they would guide me to say, okay, we'll already send this out, we'll already send notice to vacate, etc., etc. So that each of the checkpoints, they can ensure that they're doing the right things to protect you as the landlord, which you may not necessarily know, because, you know, we're not professionals in this area. So that's why you actually need to trust the property manager in this case as the industry expert, to be able to guide you and lead you to in the right steps in the worst case that the tenant is not paying and is not behaving, so that you can use these you know, as evidence later on when you try to submit a claim to insurance company. They will want to see the evidence. They want to see that you have done the correct steps in order to give tenant enough notices, enough time for them to make up for these arrears before you kick them out. And if any of these steps are not being done correctly, then unfortunately your insurance claim could be rejected or declined. So that's why, from the compliance and also from the insurance perspective, that to me, a property manager is well worth its gold. And so that's our part one about whether property manager is worth it. In our next series about property manager, I will cover more about how you go and find a property manager and what sort of questions you should be asking them when you're seeing them yourself, in order to know whether they are a qualified and a competent property manager or not. So stay tuned, and I'll see you again shortly.